Assalamu alaikum. Implonialism and the modern world is the topic of today's talk. It is a theorizing for new colonialism in Kashmir and a settler colonialism in Palestine. A successful Viennese journalist, a less successful playwright, and with no political ambitions, and the father of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl makes one pertinent observation in his 1896 or 1904 book, A Jewish State, an attempt at a modern solution of the Jewish question. He writes that all the attempts of colonizing the Jews, even by really benevolent men, have so far been unsuccessful. Similarly, Shashi Tharoor argues the same for India in his 2017 book, Inglorious Empire. If these arguments are stretched to the present times, it may be argued that if any attempts to colonize Jews or Indians had been unsuccessful, then how can we apply the same formula on the Palestinians and Kashmiris? An adjoining argument can be that if attempts of any colonizing are bound to fail, then what is this isation Israel is practicing vis-a-vis to Palestine or India in case of Kashmir? I argue that the appropriation of land, culture, and resources, marginalization, and erasure meted out to the Kashmiris and the Palestinians is beyond the hegemonic strategies of either imperialism or colonialism. Let's have the definitions of colonialism and environmentalism, and imperialism. Colonialism is defined as the policy of practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploring it economically. While imperialism, a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force, is what we call imperialism. Imperialism. So we can conclude, while imperialism is defined as a policy of extending a country's power and influence, so while colonialism has been thriving on the metaphors of educating the innumerable millions and white man's burden, imperialism has bothered itself to borrow only some of these tropes from colonialism. It works more on these lines: a land without a people, for a people without a land, or transmitters of European civilization to the uncivilized, or the agricultural settlements of Palestine. And lately, every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. So the synthesis of colonialism and imperialism gives rise to despotism and fascism, something also discussed in Daniel Calder's 2018 book, A Dictator Literature. This synthesis of despotism and fascism simply disregards any option to bother itself with any such euphemisms that colonialism had thrived upon. Neither does despotism has any use of this vocabulary, nor does it it is bothered by its imports. The previous century's recklessness causing the two world wars has ostensibly resulted in decolonizing in many parts of the world, including India, while the questions of Jewish colony in Europe resulted in Eretz Israel. However, the subsequent world order, thriving on the Cold War, is culminating into a process that is witnessing a re-colonialism, a re-imperialism, and despotism, especially in the context of the two places of Kashmir and Palestine. Understanding. This form of imperial colonial despotism that is witnessed by our world today may alternatively be called implonialism. The statistics of Indian atrocities in Kashmir and Israel's in Palestine are slender questions that even Wagner can decide, as Dr. Faustus would argue, especially when we see unrestrained genocide being carried out against humanity in the two places. This is what qualifies this imperial colonial despotism in the two realms to be beyond colonialism and imperialism. And it becomes a combination of not only colonialism and imperialism in their most heinous and barbaric forms, but also has a fair share of fascism and despotism, and thus may be neologized as imperialism. Indian neocolonialism and Israel's settler colonialism, it may be argued, therefore, is in the phase of colonial colonialism, imperialism, and despotism from which it had sought to liberate itself more than 75 years ago. Their predecessors occasionally bothered themselves to table some justifications for their policies of erasures and marginalization and genocide, but this carte blanche witness in Kashmir or Palestine today, with least bit of accountability, may be seen as implonialism. The post-colonial environmental ethic of the two places, however, with its tenet methods of inquiry, as manifested in some of the Kashmiri and Palestinian writings, questions and impedes this unrestricted blank check. There is value in entertaining the possibility that if implonialism is not checked, it has the tendency of establishing the similar patterns of imperialism, colonialism, despotism, and authoritarianism in other parts of the world, thus subverting the pervasive categories of knowledge making. We may argue that this implonialism, besides having physical implications as witnessed in Kashmir and Palestine day in and day out, has ideological underpinnings as well. This implonialism does not care much for any cover statements and is unscrupulous because it is not bothered by any environmental ethical concerns of the existing populations. It crosses all limits of consciousness for humanity and human laws, which as some historians and critics describe as unbridled ethnocracy that grossly discriminates against certain of its citizens, as Sand would argue, or define as creeping apartheid, as Blonsky would argue, especially when we now know that Palestinians are the original inhabitants of this land, embracing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in different periods of history. This term also has an implication of implosion, that is self-destruction, the destructing predilections, because they're not environmentally sustainable in the long run. I say this because European suppression, suppressing the Jewish question in Europe and colonialism in India, had to answer for their misdeeds eventually, and the Nuremberg trials for the perpetrators of Holocaust and British rollback in India can be cited as an example. Alternatively, it can be said that colonizing and appropriating all possible resources, both physical and psychological, with all possible means, is what makes this phenomenon of implonialism or colonial imperialism holding sway yonder than what colonialism and imperialism could accomplish till the first half of the 20th century. It is not that both the terms colonialism and imperialism are not interchangeable. They most definitely are, and likewise they borrow heavily from each other too. But an ism like implonialism that I am suggesting is a practice of exercising absolute power that allows for doing away with any explanatory positions that either colonialism or imperialism have ostensibly maintained in history. It has no qualms or trepidations for any accountability of the like of Nuremberg trials, and perhaps exercises indemnity in the vein of witch hunting trials of 1692 Salem, Massachusetts. In the context of Kashmir and Palestine, it is the employing of unrestrained and ongoing genocide, excruciatingly brutal, egregious, and unspeakable crimes against humanity in the 21st century. This colonial imperialism or its prodigy, implonialism, has absolutely no transparency for its ideological state apparatuses or repressive state apparatuses, to use Althusser's terms, and has a complete disregard for the environmental ethic of the place that qualifies it to be beyond colonialism and imperialism, and makes it a combination of both in the most strategically crafted, heinous, and barbaric forms. And that may be called colonialism. It therefore calls for a de-Indianization of Kashmir, as Sand argues, in Kashmir, and as Sand argues, a de-Zionation in the context of Palestine. I consider it a natural affinity that any Christian is going to feel for another Christian, or Muslim for another Muslim, and so a Jew for another Jew. But that does not entail that all Muslim, Christians, Jews, or any other religion, for that matter, they can be confined in different geographical blocks. That would be ethno-nationalism or parochial nationalism, irrespective of race and religion. Or a Christian, that would be, but a nationalism. But a nationalism that, like America, saying that an American has always civil rights irrespective of race and religion, or a Christian or a Parsi living in Pakistan is very much a Pakistani, is what I call multicultural, transcultural, and cosmopolitan nationalism. Humanity is not a flock of sheep that to be put in different pens if he or she is a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu or a Christian or Buddhist. So if Israel, India, or the Arab states, the nations, those who exercise this parochial nationalism, claim a Jewish identity for its national, or a Hindutva mindset, or a Saudi or an Arab to become a mutualized citizen of that place. It goes beyond parochial nationalism, worse than any colonialism or imperialism of the 20th century. And therefore, if only for emphasis' sake, which is more than any imperialism, colonialism, fascism, or despotism, I call it Implonialism. The first syllable in Implonialism denote the first three letters of imperialism. The second and the third syllables may be a symbol of colonialism, while the last syllable stands for the fascism or despotism that we witness in the context of Kashmir and Palestine. This settler colonialism or impregnated militarism, unaccountable for their imperialism, is what makes today's world not post-colonial world, but post-implonial world. The human beings who are facing the brunt of such shameful, hateful, brutal, egregious, and unspeakable crimes of implonialism are implonialized people living in a post-implonialized world with the lowest possible subordinate positions of an implonialized society, entity, and the real wretches of the earth. We should not be critical of a generic nationalism as criticized by many anti-nationalists or who raise objections to nationalism, but the parochial nationalism is what I call implonialism that should be weeded out of the two true multicultural, multi-ethnic, equally based nationalism with a sense of belonging, or belonging that does not have a dagger under at its every arm to slaughter anyone with different caste, color, creed, or religion. However, as Hannah Arendt would argue, that a pack of lies is brought easier than truth. So that it is quite a task to bring truth to the surface, though through this theorizing, I offer an aid for any future research in these or any similar areas. As Dr. Ryder would say in Spectres of Mask, and I quote, international law, he says, should extend and diversify its field to include, if at least it is to be consistent with the idea of democracy and of human rights. It proclaims the worldwide economic and social field beyond the sovereignty of states. Therefore, the settler colonialism of Israel and Indian occupation of Kashmir may be called a colonial imperialism or a phenomenon that extends both implications of colonialism and imperialism and neologized as implonialism. This implonialism is more aggressive due to sheer savagery of attacks, shows the moral depravity of the oppressors, and uses a hammer against a fly phenomenon. Thus, the world communities that are being put under erasure may be seen through this lens of post-implonialism. I thank you. I would welcome any questions if there be.